I've been trying to replace my Mac with an iPad for the last 15 years, basically since the first iPad came out. I want it to do everything. I want it to handle all my day-to-day work like a traditional computer, and I want it to be a tablet at the same time. Have I been successful? I mean, I bought this Mac Mini 3 months ago, so does it look like I've been successful? Hey everyone, Tech Dad here, and if you've been following my channel for a reasonable amount of time, you'll know that I've been trying to use the iPad, particularly the iPad Pro, as my only computer, or at least my main computer, for about the last year and a half. And honestly, it's kind of a tall order because I'm a project manager in my 8 to 5 job, I'm a teacher at night, I'm an avid gamer, and I just like to have a tablet. So I want to do all the things possible on this device, and for $2,000, you'd think I'd be able to do that. Well, about 3 months ago, I finally gave up because there were just a handful of things that it just couldn't do on my M5 iPad Pro. So I bought this Mac Mini to fill in the gaps. And honestly, I shouldn't be surprised that an iPad can't replace a Mac. I mean, Steve Jobs and Apple have never claimed even once that the iPad was intended to replace the Mac. In fact, when Steve Jobs launched it, he specifically said it's a third category of device. It's going to be its own thing. It's going to do some things better than a laptop or smartphone, but it's not really intended to replace either one of those products. And so maybe you're thinking of buying this M5 iPad Pro, and maybe you're thinking the same thing I did, that you could just get rid of your traditional computer and just do everything on this. And I put out a lot of content about this, and honestly, for a lot of people, you can just use this. It just depends on your use case. And something else I want to clear up is that a lot of people have tried to use the iPad as their only device, but they tried it like 8 years ago, and the iPad has changed so much due to consumer demand that it's not the same playing field that it was years ago. And so in this video, I want to discuss how Apple has evolved the iPad to become this awesome Uber device that we have now called the M5 iPad Pro. And I want to talk about how it's evolved over the years to become a powerhouse machine, but all that being said, it's not a full-on Mac replacement yet. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so in order to understand the iPad's full capabilities, you really need to understand how it's evolved over the years. And if you've tried to use the iPad as your only device years ago, you really need to try it again because it's changed a whole heck of a lot. So let's break that down. So back in 2010, when the first iPad launched, it was very limited. They called it a big iPhone, and honestly, it was pretty much a big iPhone. So first of all, there were no keyboards that were built specifically for the iPad. You could connect a keyboard via Bluetooth, but there weren't specific keyboards that were designed for the iPad like there are today. There was also no stylus or palm rejection, which is an enormous deal. So when the iPad came out, everybody wanted to write on it. Of course, it's a tablet. Well, you really couldn't do that. You could buy these little cheap styluses that had the squishy ends. There was no palm rejection. It just flat out didn't work. There was no support for secondary displays, so it didn't work like a computer where you could just hook it into a monitor and get a secondary display functionality. That just was not there. You couldn't open multiple windows. So back when the iPad first released, it was one window at a time. So multitasking, pretty much not going to happen, or at least it was very difficult. Obviously, that's a big plus to a traditional computer, is you can have lots of windows open and be multitasking like crazy. There was no support for a mouse or trackpad, so there was no cursor at all. That was not a thing on the iPad. And in addition to all those things, you also had no pro apps, so there was no Microsoft Office when this launched. In fact, Microsoft Office didn't come to the iPad for years. You had to buy like these cheap knockoff brands. And the web browser was absolutely terrible, and no web apps had been developed to work on mobile devices back then. So if you tried to use the iPad years ago, you failed right out of the gate at replacing your traditional computer. It was not gonna happen. Well, over the years, as this thing has evolved, you've got a lot more power. In fact, you have all of those things now available on the iPad. You have beautiful keyboards designed by Apple that are designed for tablets. They have the ability to magnetize to the keyboard, which means they can pop on and off really quickly and go back and forth between that tablet functionality. You've got a brilliant stylus for the M5 iPad Pro. The Apple Pencil Pro is amazing. All the palm rejection, all kinds of gestures. You can tap to change tools. The current iPad stylus is absolutely fantastic. You have secondary display support, which came out a few years ago, so now you don't have to just work on the iPad screen. You can pull up your Apple Studio display or any monitor and connect and start opening multiple windows. And now multiple windows are even better with iPadOS 26. You can open up to 12 windows on the screen. They're compatible with touch gestures, so you can move them around with your finger or with the trackpad. There's some seriously good multitasking available on the iPad now. And of course, you got a bunch of pro apps. I use all the Microsoft Microsoft Office apps. I also use Final Cut Pro for iPad to do video editing. They've got Adobe on the iPad, and Apple has its own suite, the iWork suite. So there's plenty of options to do real productivity work on the iPad now. And finally, the web browser has been so much improved, and so web apps are also better and work on mobile devices. But the iPad browser today is leaps and bounds over what it was years ago, and you can actually get real work done in it. And so you could tell that Apple is really trying to meet consumer demand, because some of us power users wanted all of that. We wanted our tablet to also act like a computer. And Apple, in a lot of ways, has delivered, and you're going to get some real power when you buy this M5 iPad Pro. Now, all that being said, this iPad Pro is still not this thing, and I don't think Apple wants it to be this thing or replace this. So what are we missing? Well, first of all, the browser is not quite desktop level yet. There's just a few things where it just doesn't quite work right, and I've pointed this out. This can go from web apps like using Smartsheet to recreational apps like using D&D Beyond. That still does not work well on this device. And even Google Docs can be funky, especially when you use Google Sheets. It just acts weird, and you have strange bugs and effects. And that's one reason I picked up this guy. In addition, those Pro apps that I mentioned still aren't full-on desktop versions. And I've mentioned, for example, in Microsoft, those apps just aren't fully complete like they are on the desktop. An example of this is in Microsoft Teams, I can't create breakout rooms. There are other functions like you can't do Excel macros. There's just a few features missing in the iPad versions of those apps. Final Cut Pro is the same way. It doesn't have all the full functionality of the desktop version. You can't do plugins. So the Mac still just has more ability to do heavy lifting when it comes to productivity. And then there are certain things that just don't run at all on iPad. And so there's some old gaming that I like to do, and I mentioned this before. I like to play World of Warcraft Classic. I just can't do that on this device. So you're going to run into some programs that just don't run at all on the iPad. And if you want to use those programs, you got to go with Mac or a PC. There's other weird little things, like if you like to use external hard drives and you like to partition those hard drives, an iPad can't read a hard drive that has multiple partitions. And I just went over this in another video about using hard drives with iPad. And you can't use the iPad to create multiple partitions on a hard drive. So it's just been little things like that that keep creeping up on me that I keep discovering, oh man, the iPad doesn't do that. I need a Mac. All right, so all that being said, would I recommend that you use an M5 iPad Pro as your only device? Well, it just depends. If you have a bit more technical needs or specific needs like I mentioned that the iPad doesn't do, you're going to need to pick up a Mac. But I will be honest, I do 95% of what I want and need to do on this iPad. There's just those few little situations where I absolutely have to have a Mac, and so I picked up an affordable Mac, the Mac Mini. I wanted to spend really as little as possible on my Mac and just get into the ecosystem just enough. And this guy does that. More content to come on this guy soon. I got a lot to say about this. I've actually started to enjoy using this device a lot more. So we'll talk about that on the channel later. And if you need both like I do, okay, then you need both. No big deal. I've learned that I don't have to pigeonhole myself into one device just because. So that's my rundown on the M5 iPad Pro and why it's just not quite a Mac replacement yet. But it's certainly an awesome device, can do a ton of work. I absolutely replaced my laptop computer. I don't need a MacBook. I really don't need a MacBook. This thing is my portable device that I take everywhere and do everything on. So let me know if you have questions about the M5 iPad Pro and my experience. Happy to help you out. That's all I got for you. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.